Gary, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I thought we'd start with sort of probably what most of our listeners would like to hear or get to know the story about, and that's 1995, the Walker Cup, Royal Porthcawl in Wales, when you famously beat Tiger Woods in the final day singles match. Peter McEvoy came up to you after the draw was made on that Friday and said, if there was anybody in Great Britain team I would have to play Tiger, it would have been you because you were not intimidated by what he does. So what if we could just start there, and what did you learn from that day playing against Tiger, and what really stood out for you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it was my first Walker Cup. I was fortunate enough to be selected eventually for 6, but this being my first one. Now, by that stage, of course, I was 35, and obviously, in a lot of ways, I developed myself as a character, whereas the majority of the international players were quite young and still, formulating who they were, what they were, how they went about things. And I think that probably one of the advantages that I had as a player was the fact that, I didn't need to have the arm around the shoulder. I was very independent. And because I developed my game so late in the day, I mean, I was a 23 handicapper at 18. And whereas most of these other lads were sort of scratch players at 18 and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of independence and a battling quality, which had served me very well from when I first started playing for England back in 1988 through to that period. And obviously England had used me as an anchorman fairly regularly. And so it was a position that Clive Brown, who was the captain of the Walker Cup that year, had decided that he was going to use me as an anchorman because I didn't really get intimidated by anybody. I just stuck to my own game, did my own thing. And, when we were discussing how, everything was going to sort of pan out for the matches, which obviously started on the Saturday. So over a weekend, you played 4 4-balls and 8 singles from a 10-man team. And, basically Clive said, well, unfortunately, I can't put you in the foursomes because I've obviously got my mind on certain pairings, but you will play the singles and you'll be off last. And on the Friday evening, they did the opening ceremony, the speeches, etc. And I was stood next to Gordon Sherry. And I can remember vividly the fact that they'd announced, the foursomes, and everyone had sort of found out where they were playing. And then in the singles, Woods hadn't been nominated in the first 3 singles games. And Gordon turned to me and quietly whispered, "You've got him," and shook my hand. And I got a great picture of Gordon at 6'8" or whatever he was, shaking my hand. Afterwards, Peter came up to me and said, look, if there was anybody that I'd want to have play Tiger Woods, who was undoubtedly at that stage the best amateur in the world. I mean, he'd won 2 US amateurs back to back, and prior to that, 3 US junior championships in a row. So, I mean, he was already a celebrated player, had been part of the winning American Eisenhower Trophy team the year before in Paris. So, age 18, quite a phenomenon. But, the funny thing is that the American team had turned up in Britain when we'd had an amazing summer. And I'd won the British Mid-Amateur, the inaugural British Mid-Amateur at Sunningdale. And that's when Clive had decided who his final 2 picks were. Now, controversially, he'd picked 8 prior to that. And so in some respects, some people would have said, oh, you were an afterthought, etc., etc. It didn't bother me. There was one player, Gary Harris, who had basically decided, well, if you're not going to pick me for the 8, then, I'm just going to turn professional, which, I could quite understand why Gary felt that way. He was one of the best players in Britain at that stage. But for me, it was still the factor of, being able to represent my country at the very highest level, having been playing for England regularly since 1988. So, it was then announced that Tiger Woods would play Gary Wolstenholme in the last match, and there was a big ooh like this. And I'm sure that Tiger Woods must have looked around and gone, why are they doing that? I'm basically here to tick a box. And that's really what he was doing. I mean, his amateur career was just about beating every record that Jack Nicklaus had. And that's what his whole ethos was, being the best player in the world. Jack Nicklaus had been the previous best player in the world, and I'm going to be the best player now. And he'd been ticking boxes, winning the Eisenhower Trophy team with the American team. And then he's going to play Walker Cup, win the Walker Cup, win another US amateur, turn professional, and then just basically win every major under the sun. And the funny thing was that the weather turned just literally that week. And Porthcawl, unfortunately, had a little bit of disease. And the greens were very quick, but quite bumpy. And the fairways were sort of slightly soggy, having been burnt to a frazzle and then had this rain. And it wasn't particularly the most beautiful golf course that you could have chosen in the United Kingdom. However, what a wonderful match play venue it is. And of course, for me, we're used to this, whereas the Americans weren't. And I think that what Peter said to me was obviously great. It was a compliment, because obviously Peter was certainly one of the greatest British amateurs there's ever been. And, he'd been my captain before this. So he knew exactly who I was, what I stood for, etc., etc. And, in some respects, the rest of the team did too. I don't think anyone relished the prospect of ever playing me. There's people that wanted to beat me, but actually didn't, in truth, want to play me when they could have maybe beaten somebody else. So I had an ability to get under people's skin. Everyone would outdrive me, and then I'd somehow get up and down from silly places. And it actually is a wearing trait as an opponent to actually do that, and that was one of my greatest strengths.
I was going to say, what are the best ways you ignore the players or like competition, such as someone who, like Tiger, came in with such a strong record? How do you focus on your own game and ignore theirs?
Well, I mean, in that match, basically, Tiger could drive 3 of the par 4s, could hit every one of the par 5s with no more than a 5-iron maximum. So, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to compete with him in that respect. I just had to play my own game. I had to find fairways, had to find greens, and then try and utilize one of my greatest strengths, which obviously is putting. In at that period, that's what I really focused on. Yes, obviously on my day, I could sort of put a reasonable drive out there, but it was nowhere near in comparison to the rest. Whereas Woods was, over 2 shots, the longest player by miles in either team. And, it was actually phenomenal to watch. And I can remember 18 months later, when Woods had won the US Masters by 12 shots, they actually said and phoned me up and said, look, did you see that this was likely to happen? And I said, well, yes. I mean, he had an amazing short game, and he was the longest player by a mile. So, it's something that you just literally play your own. I just wanted to hit as many good shots as possible. And I suppose in some respects, I was on a hiding to nothing. I was playing the best player. If I lost, everyone went, well, he's the best player. But if you win, you're the hero. Well, that didn't really matter to me. All I was interested in doing was winning. Winning every match that I played, every tournament that I played in. And I didn't get highs and lows. So, for instance, I can remember quite a few of the Scots turning up at the home internationals after that and saying, well, I don't really want to play. I mean, we've won the Walker Cup when it was starting to be called the Walkover Cup, because America kept winning and winning and winning. And I'm being very fortunate that I've been on 4 winning teams, which is a record in itself. out of the 6 matches, and the one of the ones that we lost, we only lost by 1 point. So I like to feel as though, what I was able to bring to the party to a certain extent was, why should we consider that we're the underdogs? Why should we think that we're not going to win? We're all capable of playing great golf, and certainly my attitude was, give me a golf course, give me 14 fairways, 18 greens. Why can't I win? And I just stuck to my own game, and I was used to being outdriven by everybody. So the fact that Tiger was 100 yards past me on occasions really didn't make a huge amount of difference. Yes, I enjoy watching that sort of thing myself.
Did you actually watch him hit the ball? Did you have your head down when he would just ignore?
I mean, I just enjoyed it all. I mean, he was a phenomenon. At his age, to do what he'd done and break the records that he'd done, etc., etc., etc. He really had set alight the amateur game, and for us to be able to then get the opportunity to see him, playing in the United Kingdom, was a definite privilege. There's no doubt about that. Now, the fact that, he wasn't going to, talk to me, be my friend, okay, well, that's fair enough. We're there to win our match. But, I don't think he had a huge number of friends, in inverted commas, because he was very insular. It was him and them. He might argue with that, but it seemed that way. I remember Downing Gray, the American captain, saying, well, if he'd turned up on the bus late, no one would have said a thing. But because Chris Riley turned up having fallen asleep, everyone was giving him a hard time. It's interesting that, and Downing Gray is a very bright individual, and I think he'd sort of really worked out that just let Tiger do his thing. And, from my point of view, it was good to watch. I mean, there's nothing wrong with trying to feed off that. And I think I probably hit the ball a bit better because of the fact that I was playing with somebody like him.
I was actually with, I think, an old school friend of yours, or not school friend, but old friend, a chap called Malcolm Lewis yesterday.
Oh, yes.
As we were both Bristol based, and I think members of I'm a member of your club, Bristol and Clifton, and just moved to the Berkshire. But he very kindly handed me your book, which I know he wrote a chapter in, the long and the short of it. Just wanted to bring up something in your book. He said, all my clothes were laid out each of the days with socks, underwear, my daily intake of vitamin tablets, packet of cereal I would be eating that day. For me, it was absolute normal. Have you always been sort of, in a way, preparing for success like that? Has that always been an element of your life? And perhaps could you give us some other examples of sort of how you've best prepared in your golfing success in those sort of extreme measures?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of OCD in this. I like to be prepared. I don't particularly like surprises. I like to be on time. I like to be having every dot, every T crossed. Now, when I first started, I couldn't afford that. I can remember turning up to a match representing Leicestershire against Suffolk, and basically they turned up in the car park and said, right, £5 a man, winner take all, and I had £2.57 in my pocket, and I couldn't afford to lose, and I shot 66 and took the money. So I couldn't afford to be as quite as well prepared as I finished up being able to do. But yes, I mean, the other players found this all a bit odd. I had one instance where I was down at breakfast, and we were competing in, I think, the European Championships or something like that. And the other players came down, and each one had one of my shirts on. And the first one I sort of looked and I thought, God, that looks like one of my shirts. And I was about to comment, and then the next guy came in, and then the next guy came in, and they'd all decided that they were going to go into my room and, basically, take one of my shirts and put it on, thinking this was hilariously funny, which I suppose it probably was to them. To me, it wasn't. As you can imagine, someone with OCD, I certainly didn't want anything moving. Everything was in its place. So that probably wasn't the best thing that could have ever happened for me. But I like to, I like to make sure that I'm prepared. That I've got my protein bars, I've got my muesli or my porridge for breakfast. I take it with me everywhere just in case, unless I happen to know the hotel is going to be able to provide these things for me. If they do, then I don't need to bring them. But whenever I'm traveling, the first night normally I'm not there early enough to be able to get the sort of dinner that I'd want. So I actually take the food that I want for dinner, which often comprises of baked beans, because it's a fantastic source of protein and roughage. I get the low sugar, low salt version, but that's me. I try and make sure that I've got my yardage book, if I have one already in the bag, and I try and make sure that everything is in place. So yes, I've worked out, having checked the weather for the previous week, whether I need hot clothes, cold clothes, waterproofs, the whole thing. I mean, anything that's going to help me compete better, I will have hopefully been able to put in the bag and be ready to utilize come almost any eventuality. And there's odd occasions where you get caught out. Yes, of course there is. But I do try and prepare the best I possibly can. I check my biorhythms, which interestingly, I don't think anybody that I know has ever bothered to do that.
Biorhythms?
Yeah.
What is that?
It's basically, the main three biorhythms are emotional, physical, and intellectual. And basically, your biorhythms start from the moment you're born, or the hour that you're born. And they work in three different rhythms that last over a certain distance of days and certain number of days. And basically, they keep flowing right away through your entire life. So you can actually plot what your biorhythms are going to be on any particular day, at any particular time. So, I look at that, and if my emotional is low, then I try and listen to uplifting music, wear bright colors. If my physical is low, then I try and rest as much as possible. I take on protein bars or a little bit more food. And if my intellectual's low, then I'm trying to go through the processes doubly. But this is an important aspect that I learned very early in my career. Before I started playing for England, I met a guy who was an expert in this particular field, and it's something that I utilize very strongly. There are other rhythms that you can also incorporate within it, but those are the three main ones.
Do you use a piece of software for that to track it? Or
yeah, there is. That you can get apps on the internet now. Obviously, I had somebody that used to do it for me, and I then sort of found an app that was going to be able to allow me to work it out well in advance. So often it might actually even go to the extent of me deciding which tournament to play or not to play if I had to make a choice. Obviously, with professional golf on the Stay Short Tour, you're never really given a choice. You basically have to play every event that you're able to play. But it still allows me to be able to sort of say, well, right, this week I need to wear a lot of bright colours, I need to rest a lot, or I need to do more stretching. These things are all actually very, very important. And certainly, as far as I'm concerned, the food that I take on board is very much dictated by, again, that aspect to it as well. Plenty of water. I don't tend to drink fizzy drinks at all. So these are all aspects that I take into consideration on a regular basis.
That's fascinating. Do you remember the name of the app you use? Or
Well, it's just biorhythms. If you type biorhythms in, I mean, I've got actually 4 biorhythm chart just to be able to check if they're all exactly the same. They should be, but I always make sure that I am, well prepared on that side of it.
Sure, that's fascinating. Do you use a checklist to maintain all of the things that you've got going on, or do you just store it in your head and you just know how to
Uh,
go through it?
Pretty much store it in my head. I mean, obviously, I check the weather apps as well, so that's quite important too. So, for instance, if it's going to be cooler, then obviously I make, take more layers and that sort of thing. So, again, it's a factor that I'm trying to sort of take on board every aspect that's going to affect my potential performance. And it might be that I, might take more than 14 clubs with me. I mean, I might, I tend to carry a 5 rescue and a 4 rescue. Well, I might actually put a 5 iron in if I need to hit a lower ball flight and that sort of thing. I might take 2 or 3 putters with me, particularly if I'm in the UK. But it might determine which wedge, lob wedge I'm going to use. So, from all those aspects, I'm trying to give myself the very best opportunity for success. So these are all things that, yes, sometimes I write it down. I'm working out what I've got to not forget because there's an awful lot of things I have to remember. But it's just making sure you've got the right currency with you, that you've got enough currency for the things that you need to pay for, like caddies or food or whatever, any eventuality. My whole path is been each week trying to determine, and I will have out already the yardage books that I've got from the previous year. I'm very fortunate to have a Sky Caddy now, one of the top of the range ones, which also helps. I've got a top of the range laser. These are all bits that I have to have and get put in. My carry-on luggage for flights and that sort of thing. There are, every little space is filled. And I'll even take, my porridge sachets with me, and they're all placed in one thing. And then the golf balls, I never leave in my golf bag. I always carry them in my hand luggage. And, from that point of view, that's very important because I've been told years ago that the decompression, on the golf ball can affect. Now, whether it's true now with the modern golf ball, I don't know. But certainly in the past, maybe golf balls were affected. So I'd never let the golf balls be in the hold. It's a stupid thing, but
I find all this stuff absolutely fascinating. I was going to sort of ask what sort of unusual things do you carry to tournaments with you, or training aids, which you could perhaps go into specific detail.
Yeah, training aids. The best one that I've ever had, to me, because there's an awful lot of gimmicky stuff out there and gadgets that you can have. But the Orange Golf Whip Trainer, which, funnily enough, I met the guy who markets Orange Golf Whip Trainer. He is the sort of the inventor, if you like, at the Senior Open qualifying last year at Ladybank, and we chatted for quite some time. And I finished up buying other products that he produces. There's a pitching aid, which is like a wedge on the end of a sort of a whippy shaft, and a putter, which has a bowed face. So you have to get it out the middle for it to go online with a whippy shaft. I mean, it sounds a bit gimmicky, but actually they all work really well. And if you practice with them enough, I guarantee you everyone would benefit from it. It's that I must have sold, if I got a commission, it'd be worth it. But I must have sold literally hundreds of Orange Golf Whip Trainers, because everybody asks me. I mean, the number of guys that have got them on the Stayshore Tour now, because they've seen me using it, and then they come and tried it, and then they bought one. So I was
how do you what data do you collect on your game? Do you carry like a practice journal, or do you do any software?
I wish I did. It's funny. only because it's something that I could then pass on to other people, perhaps. But again, I'm obviously very self-reliant. I understand my game inside out, and during my England days, we had to keep stats, and there were some interesting aspects to it. But to me, in the end, it just put more pressure on my game. I had an overall stat one year of for every par three I played in 100 rounds of competitive stroke play, I had 3 dead, which,
What do you mean by that?
let me tell you, that is incredibly hard. I used to get made a lot of twos. But obviously that meant that obviously I must have made a few bogeys as well. But if most people who do stats look at their par three average, and if you over 100 rounds of golf, they're 3 dead. They've played really well. And then I remember Nigel Furness, who was the performance director for England, saying I was the straightest player in the world of people that did stats, where I think it was 87.9% of fairways. I said to him, well, it's not entirely accurate, because there are times when I'm actually aiming at the right-hand rough to try and get, or left-hand rough to get a bit of a flyer to help me try and reach the par fives. So strictly speaking, it's not that accurate. I'm not as accurate now as I used to be, but my clubhead speed's slightly quicker than it used to be. And that always is going to mean that you're probably going to miss a few more fairways. But, the fact that I was insanely straight, but it was one of the strengths I had. I mean, match play, basically my opponent knew for a fact that I really wasn't going to miss a fairway, and I wasn't going to miss many greens. And if I did miss greens, I was probably going to get up and down or chip in. So, that in itself probably puts an intimidatory factor, on who you're playing and where you're playing them. So, I didn't, and I don't keep stats now. I mean, a lot of guys will go, "Oh, I putted rubbish." Now I know whether I'm putting rubbish or not, but often those guys were actually, it wasn't their putting that was the problem. It was actually their tee shots. Their tee shots weren't finding the fairway. So subsequently, there were more pressure on the second shot. So if they did get it on the green, they weren't as close. So they were then putting more pressure on their putting from long distance. They were probably leaving themselves 5-6 footers, which they weren't holding. So it wasn't the fact that they weren't putting particularly well. It was the fact that they were missing fairways. And this was the interesting thing that I learned from statistical analysis, was that, it's never quite as straightforward as it might seem. And to me, I always tended to practice the things that I was poor at anyway. So I would always, in years gone by before hybrids came in, I'd always be practicing my 3-iron. And I knew that if I was hitting my 3-iron well, then the rest of my game was actually pretty good. And so I would actually work hard on my 3-iron, whereas I noticed an awful lot of other guys didn't work on their chipping and putting very much. And that was actually the worst part of the game. Or, they loved hitting the driver, which was great because they hit it really well. But then they didn't work on the weak parts of their game as much because they didn't enjoy that. And I think I was, again, a bit of an oddball from the point of view that I actually enjoyed practicing the things that I wasn't particularly good at. I'd always try and set myself a goal of hitting off poorish turf, as an example, tight lies. And I could see all the other guys teeing the ball up if the practice ground wasn't very good. And I was thinking, well, what's the point of doing that? Because if you hit them well off a poorish lie, then when you get a really good lie, it's actually going to be an awful lot easier. So, I'd always give myself, those sorts of goals, I suppose. And, I knew my game inside that. I knew what I needed to work on. So statistics weren't really going to help me a huge amount. But it was an interesting exercise. Staying on a par three, thinking I don't want to miss the green. It was silly. I've got to hit every fairway today to maintain my standards. You don't want to have that sort of pressure on yourself. You just want to go out and play.
That sort of answered my next question: is how do you structure your practice? So I guess you work on the things that you're not great at, and you make them slightly tougher and more challenging than what they would be in a sort of a tournament-like scenario.
Yeah, very often. I mean, you do work on. I mean, for instance, as a good example, about 5-6 weeks ago, I was playing probably the best golf of my life. I was hitting the ball further than I've ever done before. The new Titleist ball certainly seems to go a bit further, so that was helping. But I was making a few little tweaks to my game, lifting the left heel to allow my left hip to make a little bit better rotation. So I was actually getting a slightly longer swing, subsequently hitting the ball a little bit further as well. Now, and then the light switch goes off for what I thought was no real apparent reason. Obviously, perhaps, my alignment wasn't as good as it should have been, and it just crept into my game. And then subsequently, all of a sudden, my game just dissipated. Now it's the battle of, right, you've got to go back to basics, all the things that you got taught by all your best coaches in the past. And I've been very lucky that when I got to about 31, I started getting proper coaching. And, I wish that I'd had better coaching earlier. But, that's when I really started to get proper coaching. And, it made a huge difference. But I couldn't achieve what I was being asked to do because, my body blueprint didn't allow me to be able to make some of the moves. Now, over the years, eventually I have made those changes. And, it would be interesting to go back to those original coaches and say, what do you think now? But as I say, just at the moment, sadly, now that we've started the main trawl of the season for the Stayshore Tour, I seem to have stumbled a little bit, and I just need to get back into those regimes which have been successful in the past. So, I've just got a hard job to do. It's like I think, I used to practice hours and hours on end. Okay, I can't do that as much now because my body won't really allow me to do it getting towards 60 as I am. But, I still, work pretty hard and, dedicated to achieving, those sorts of, highs that I've had in the past. But it's not easy. And there are times when actually sitting down and thinking about it rather than just standing there bashing balls is often more productive.
So you would sort of create more of a plan going ahead of when things aren't going as well.
Subconscious is an incredible thing, and if I haven't played particularly well, I might go on the range, just try and work on smoothing out some of the kinks, but I might only hit 30, 40, 50 shots. And then I'll go away, and while I'm sleeping, the brain's working on it. And the next morning, hopefully, I find a little something, whether it's looking at a different part of the golf ball instead of the front instead of the back, as an example, or a different stretch, or perhaps changing the composition of the clubs, all sorts of things. Anything just to give you that percentage point more of an advantage going into the following day. So I was always looking for something. It's you never achieve perfection, but when you have a spell where you're playing really, really well, that's great. But you've still got to be constantly monitoring everything, and maybe. That was something that I hadn't done particularly 6 weeks ago, and it just imploded a little bit. But these things happen every now and again, and you've just got to work through it.
I was going to say, what are some of the best way you've learned to handle your mental game during a round? Like, what do you think about? What's the internal dialogue when you're sort of halfway through a round to sort of closing it out?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, obviously it's about tactically, you've worked out how to play the golf course. There's no doubting about that. So, from my point of view, each shot becomes the moment. And, really, there's no point worrying about what's happened because it's already happened. You can't change the past. And there's no point about worrying about what's going to happen in the future. I think too many people worry about, oh, well, if I do this, that might happen. And, there's no point in doing that. You basically got to tactically work out, what percentage option is going to be the best for any particular shot that you play. And then you might gamble. You might have to gamble if you're in a playoff, for instance. But to me, it's just about taking each shot literally as it comes and trying to play the best shot you possibly can. And, it's about understanding, what might work best. Of course it does. But sometimes you do have to take a bit of a gamble. And again, it's those percentage options which then hopefully put you in good stead. But you really need to know your game inside out to make that, a successful tactic. But I'm I'll be looking at the views. For instance, Switzerland next week. If I'm fortunate enough to be able to play, I'm first reserve at the moment. But if I'm fortunate enough to be able to play, I love the place. I just look at the views, look at the mountains, enjoy the weather. I'll chat about whether England are doing well in the cricket or rugby or football, or whether Lewis Hamilton's going to win the Grand Prix. In between shots, I can talk about almost anything. But then once I'm getting towards the ball, I'm already assessing my shot. I've played my practice rounds, hopefully, and I've got a good idea of what I'm going to be having to do next. So, it's about switching off and on, but it's also about trying to make sure that you are ready to play when it's your turn.
You sound incredibly grounded. Is that something you work on just by the sort of things you're saying? I'm just picking up on. Is it? Do you work on any meditation or any sort of exercises like that?
It's because we used to have a psychologist that came to the England squad sessions, and I can remember he's a lovely guy, Brian Hemmings, lovely guy, and basically we'd sort of be chatting for sort of half an hour. He said, Gary, I haven't really learnt anything about you, but but we've always finished up talking about somebody else, and I don't really like talking about me particularly, and although this would obviously maybe prove otherwise, but the fact is that I am me, and before the England opportunities came up in '86 when I first joined the squad. Again, you see, I was 25, 26 by the time I'd sort of been selected for the squads. And so, I was already a formulated individual. I was who I was. And a lot of the others were very young guys, 16, 17, 18, or maybe a little bit older, but not much. And they were still growing and learning about who they were and what made them tick. And some guys needed an awful lot of cajoling or arm around the shoulder. And some were just incredibly grounded individuals who, you sort of knew that they were going to be super reliable. Peter McAvoy always used to use the phrase, well, if I had to be tied to somebody going up Everest, he was the person I would have liked to have been tied to, because I knew that he was never going to give in and he was always going to do his job. And, he once described me as that. He used it as a motivational speech. And, I suppose in some respects that was me. I was very self-reliant. Golf is that sort of sport. And yet, funnily enough, I used to enjoy the team aspect to it, which obviously now as a professional, you very rarely ever get that. Well, you don't get that opportunity unless you Ryder Cup or whatever. But, I've always enjoyed that aspect to it. And I suppose in some respects that was partly one of the reasons why I wasn't that worried that, I hadn't turned professional when I saw so many others doing so, and then obviously making a lot of money from the game.
This is a sort of personal question from my end. I was lucky enough to play in the Berkshire Trophy the other week, which I know you've won. I think, is it 3 times?
Yeah, that's right.
And I think to kill to kill the nerves going in, I sort of went in with the attitude of not caring at all. And when I sort of pitched up on the first tee, I didn't feel any nerves, and actually it sort of counteracted or backfired in the sense where I had no focus point because there were no nerves. There was it was almost just playing with your sort of granddad, and ended up shooting an 85 and spent most of the time in the trees and the woods in the morning, and in the afternoon managed to get my focus back, and feeling the nerves again like something actually mattered. I was just wondering what are some of the best ways you found to handle those nerves before getting underway at a tournament, that sort of hour beforehand, and the sort of best mindset going into a tournament.
I think when you first get faced with this, it is quite tough because you don't want to make a mistake. Everything tends to speed up. You start to worry about whether a shot's going to go where you want it to go. From my perspective, as I got used to the fact of being under pressure, in inverted commas, because pressure is actually something you only create for yourself. There's no such thing as a lump of pressure that goes on your shoulders. It is something you do create. In other words, it's your own expectation or worry of whether you're going to fulfill your expectation that makes the difference. And from my perspective, basically, it's good to have nerves. And one of the great little sayings that I picked up on early on was, it's fine to have butterflies. It's just what formation they fly in that makes the difference. And interestingly, Ben Stokes today in the cricket, yes, you have nerves, you're bound to, but actually, if you channel it correctly, it can help you to perform significantly better. Golf is slightly different because you've got to try and control the adrenaline. You don't want to have too much adrenaline when you're chipping and putting, as an example. But that's about, controlling your breathing. It can be a number of things that you can go through that are going to help you to relax. I mean, obviously, if you're hitting the ball decently on the practice ground, that's going to help. But really, it is just having a plan and just focusing on one shot at a time and trying to hit that shot the best that you can. And it is about, the fairway can be 100 yards wide, but it's about picking a single point. And if you're starting to hit that single point on a regular basis, then the approach shots become a little bit easier. And then, it's about chipping. It's about visualizing the shot and seeing it where it lands and how hard it's got to be hit. Same with putting. It's about controlling what your body does, and you only do that through repetitive practice. That's what the pros do. That's why they tend to be generally better than some of the amateurs. It's just that they don't necessarily hit better shots. They just hit more of them and less bad ones. And, it's also about how bad or good your bad shots are. And, again, if you think through a process for each shot, hopefully your bad shots are never that bad. You can still make a bogey, don't get me wrong, but you're taking double bogey out of the equation very often. It can affect anybody. Anybody can get pressure and get worried and anxious and apprehensive about a particular shot or a circumstance. But to be honest, you've just got to face up to it. There's no point shying away and saying, "Oh, I had a bad lie" or whatever. If you duffed a shot, you've got to understand that was you, and what are you going to do to make yourself so that you're not going to do that under the next time you're faced with that particular shot. And that's the hard part. It's about recognizing that. It's about facing up to it, facing up to your fears. If you do that enough and you examine how you feel and what you're worried about, then hopefully, as and when it happens, you have a plan. And you understand how it's going to feel and what you're going to do to overcome it. And I think it's like anything, preparation is everything. And, it's also about understanding you as an individual. I think the older you become, hopefully, the better you become at it.
Thank you. It's a fantastic question. Fantastic answer. Really appreciate it. We'll finish with some rapid fire questions and then sort of wrap it up. What is the one thing you're always trying to do when it comes to course management? These can be sort of rapid fire answers, if you like.
I just make sure that my practice is as effective as possible. So, I'm looking at where I'm going to try and drive the ball to, where's the best place to drive the ball, and then determining on, if you hit it a long way or a shorter distance, what's going to be the best way to approach the next shot. So it's shot for shot. Basically, I go out and practice and try and work out how best to play the hole.
What are 1 to 3 books that have greatly influenced your life?
Harvey Pennock's The Little Red Golf Book was probably the best book, and I actually highlighted certain passages in it which I liked, and obviously then reread those at particular times through my career. But that was always a great book. I love the R&A Golfer's Handbook. Sadly, they don't produce it anymore. I think that's a tragedy, personally. It can't be because of money, because they've got plenty of it. But, to me, that was a brilliant book. And I used it a lot. How to get to certain places, what the courses were like, all the rules and regulations, who achieved what, all the stats. I love all that. So that was always a favourite of mine. And funnily enough, the Gordon Simmons book about the Walker Cup was a very good book too. Not that I've read it a lot, but it was enjoyable because it sort of reminded you of those opportunities and things that you'd done as a player. So I really enjoyed that too. So, and I'm a big fan of Bobby Jones. He's sort of like a hero, I suppose. And there's a great book, The Grand Slam, which is Mark Frost's book. And that's a very good book. It's quite intriguing that somebody could cope with the pressure, because he was a very nervous individual, amazingly. And in 1930, he managed to win the Grand Slam, which I don't think anybody could really appreciate how hard that was to achieve in those days.
What is the one of the best, most worthwhile investments you ever made for your game that was under £100?
The Orange Golf Whip Trainer, without any doubt at all.
Okay.
It was just it's just a great device. It's a stretching device, and it's also a fitness device. So just very, very useful.
I think we'll have to get you on that sales commission structure with that company. In the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior, or habit has most improved your life?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I think it's about. That's a really tough one, because to be honest, there isn't anything new out there particularly that's had that much of an influence.
It can be sort of off the golf course related as well, if you like.
Yeah, I think it's probably perhaps thinking about taking on board the gluten-free and lactose-free diets. Justin Rose has gone gluten-free, and I've sort of thought about it, but obviously I've got to consider my mum as well, who I live with. But that I think is something I might well consider in the future.
Okay, so that's not implemented yet.
Not yet, but it's something I'm seriously, because the products weren't really out there then, and now they are, and it's a little bit easier to perhaps try and follow that sort of regime. It's not so easy when you're competing, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'd imagine sort of getting those available options on tour life could be a little hard.
Very difficult. Very difficult.
Okay, sort of wrap things up. We sort of end each show with a sort of personal action challenge, something which you believe in or do daily that's greatly impacted your life, which you recommend the listeners to maybe adopt in theirs. So far away.
It's definitely stretching. There's absolutely no doubt in my life that in the last, because I always had a problem with my back. I broke my left leg when I was very young, and it created a scoliosis in my spine. And I found that I was getting bad backs, and it did affect me to the extent where I had to pull out of a few tournaments over the years. But the stretching regime that I've adopted through the osteopaths and the physios that I've had has allowed me to be able to compete a lot more pain-free. And it's also about the vitamin and minerals. There are all sorts of things out there that can just help with your joints, because obviously, if you get hitting balls on a regular basis to the amount that I have done, you're going to get a lot of repetitive strain injury and obviously issue with joints. So, there are things like glucosamine, chrondotin, and devil's claw and stuff like that make such a difference to your joints and being pain-free in that aspect. So, to me, look at every aspect that maybe affects your performance and see if you can go down and buy obviously vitamins and minerals that will help you.
Is there any specific time when you do your stretching? Is it in the mornings, and how long would it last for?
Always morning, always night. And I do it for about 40 minutes. So, it's a pretty comprehensive lower body, back stretching. Yes, okay, if years gone by I'd had more of an opportunity to do gym work, I would have done that. Unfortunately, where I am in Kendal, there isn't really a particularly good gym. And you need to have that facility very close, within 15 minutes, either walk or drive. If you don't have that, then it's almost impossible to get on a regular basis into a regime. So, again, I would try and maybe consider getting your own mini gym, and you can do that relatively cheaply. Forearm strength can be done with a bottle filled with water or sand. And I think that certainly a lot of girls could, because inherently they tend to be slightly weaker in the hands and forearm. If they wanted to become better players, then strengthen that aspect of their body in particular.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for all the time you've given us here today. Where can people find more about you or follow you online? Is there any recommended books or sort of your own books? I know you've got the long and the short of it out. Feel free to let us know where we can follow you.
Yeah, I think the internet, obviously, it's www.garywolstenholme.com. My management company try to keep that pretty much up to date, although that's not easy, of course. But the long and the short of it was an interesting exercise. It says it's an autobiography, but really it was a biography, and it was done fairly quickly. But it does give an insight into the fact that you don't necessarily have to be a child prodigy to be successful. So, hopefully people can pick up from that. For me, you just keep an eye on the Stay Shore Tour, and that'll give you some idea of how I'm performing and what I'm up to. So, they're probably the three best ways of finding out a little bit more about me.
Wonderful. Gary, thank you so much for this. Really greatly appreciated, and we wish you all the very best in the upcoming season and the rest of your tournaments coming up.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Okay. Cheers, Gary. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.